Academic Paternalism, Joan C. Callahan. The third article that we look at in Chapter 4 deals with academic paternalism, or the relationship between students and the university and faculty. And Callahan's article is a defense of, essentially, the sorts of policies or practices that most departments require of students. So all of you in this course, I'm willing to guess, are probably here because it was a university requirement. What Callahan asks is are these types of requirements, like a professional ethics course, paternalistic? Going back again to the Priestley model where we talked about paternalism as a sort of relationship between a parent and a child. So what Callahan's going to look at, or she's going to ask, is the question, are university college department policies or practices paternalistic? So when you're told you have to take X number of university requirements or certain courses in order to get a major, is that kind of requirement or those kind of requirements paternalistic? There are two possible classes of paternalism, and Callahan says she's only going to talk about academic paternalism and not non-academic paternalism in the university. So academic paternalism, as I've already mentioned, are things like department requirements. Non-academic paternalism deals with the sorts of things you might find in a dorm room, like dorm rules. What time you have to be in the dorm, what time doors are locked, whether or not you can have guests overnight in the dorm room, maybe restrictions on alcohol use. Even if you're 21 years or older and live in the dorm, you still may be required to follow those sorts of rules. Whether or not those are paternalistic, Callahan isn't going to look at. I think she implies that there are some of those types of relationships between students and the university that might be paternalistic. But what she's really concerned about are those relationships in the classroom setting. So she's asking, what is the appropriate model of the university student and the faculty-student relationship? And that's what her article is looking at. The paradigm case of paternalism. As mentioned before, paternalism is a relationship where one party acts on the presumption that he or she knows what is best for the other party. This is page 106 in your textbook. Paternalism normally involves beneficence or the interest in the well-being of a child. So when we talk about the paradigm case of paternalism, we're talking about the parent-child relationship. In such cases, normally when we think of a healthy parent-child relationship, we think that the paternalistic actions are for the benefit of the child. So as a supervisor of mine once wrote, I think all of us are glad that when we turned 7 years old, our parents didn't give us a six-pack, a shotgun, and the keys to the pickup truck. That sort of restriction on our autonomy or our freedom was probably a good thing. It was in our best interest that our parents restricted the sorts of things that we could do when we were children. Now, paternalism in and of itself isn't objectionable unless it's applied to adults, and especially in cases where we applied paternalistic sort of actions to adults without benefiting those adults. So Callahan says in most cases paternalism will be objectionable when we're talking about people who are of rational, mature age. So the minute you turn 18, although that might seem to be somewhat of an arbitrary distinction, but most will agree that at 18 you're allowed to sign contracts and take on full-time employment. You're not required to go to school and so forth and so on. So at that point, to act paternalistically to someone who is of age would seem to be morally problematic. And the question Callahan is asking is, does this paradigm case of paternalism apply to the types of things that universities require of their students? The problem of paternalism in higher education. Callahan notes that when policies, decisions, or behaviors involve an interference with the liberty of students for their own good, we might have a case of paternalism. Or when policies, decisions, or behaviors towards students involve treating students in patronizing or other ways which fail to recognize their adult status, we also may have a situation of paternalism. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are some practices which might be construed as paternalistic when it comes to the university setting. So, for instance, the dorm rules that I mentioned, possibly interactions between professors and students. Is it morally permissible for a professor to date a student that isn't in their class? those types of rules might be paternalistic, especially when we're dealing with, say, two mature students or a professor and a student who's coming back after 10 years in the job force. So in such cases, you might think that those types of things would be paternalistic. Prohibitions against drinking on campus or making a campus a dry campus might be a case of paternalism when there are a large number of students who are of age. So in those types of cases, you might find paternalism. What Callahan is going to argue is that what occurs in higher education, at least when we restrict it to the academic setting, is not paternalistic. And so the case she's going to have to, or what she's going to have to do, is show why these policies, decisions, or behaviors aren't interfering with your liberty, and they're not treating you in a patronizing manner. So that's the sort of problem, or that's the sort of argument she needs to give in order to justify her position. The instructor-student relationship. The reason Callahan holds that the university is not paternalistic is essentially because the relationship between students and instructors, and in fact the student and the university, is essentially contractual. So all policies or actions based on the presumption that one party knows what is best for another don't count as paternalistic. Remember, we talked about children. When we talk about children, parents presumably know what's best for their children. In such cases, we do have an issue of paternalism. But the fact that one person knows more than another, or a group of individuals know more than others, doesn't mean that a relationship is necessarily paternalistic. What's fundamentally different between the instructor-student relationship and the parent-child relationship is that the service being provided is requested by the client or trainee, or, in this case, student. So in other words, when you come to a university, you understand that there are going to be requirements made of you. In part, you allow or go along with these requirements because you desire the outcome, the degree, or you desire the information that you're getting. So if you're going into something very specific like engineering, you're going to assume that there's a number of things you don't know. There are a number of things you're going to need to know before you can actually do engineering. So math requirements, physics requirements, and other courses might be necessary in order to do the more advanced work later. And since you don't know all of those things in the advanced work, what that's going to entail, there are others who know what's best, and you can assume that coming into a university setting that there are things that are going to be required of you that you might not see the need for, at least at the beginning. So the reason there isn't paternalism is because you've essentially consented to this form of treatment. Rights of the trainee. As I've already mentioned, Callahan is arguing that the reason the relationship between students and instructors and students in the university is not paternalistic is that both parties understand what the nature of this relationship is in a contractual way. Now, what that also entails is that the student actually has certain rights. Because this relationship is not paternalistic, the student on the student side or the trainee side can ask or require justification for professional decisions. They have the right and freedom to ignore a professional's advice and a right to withdraw from the relationship. So for instance, you might ask why you were graded in a particular way. You may ask for a syllabus as sort of like a formal contract as far as the requirements of a course go. So if the course requires 3 assignments and 4 or 5 are assigned, then the terms of the contract have been changed, and you might say, look, I need a justification for this change. And if you didn't agree to changes midstream, then you have sort of a rights-based claim against the instructor. The right or freedom to ignore a professional's advice is also there. So for instance, you may have to fulfill course requirements, but if an instructor says something like, you ought to do this in addition to the work I've said, or you'll never make it as a journalist or as a writer or something along those lines, the trainee has a right to simply ignore professional's advice. Right? So outside of the formal academic setting, as far as course requirements go and the material to be learned, that's one thing, but professional's advice need not be taken. And the right to withdraw from the relationship. So in such a case, you may say, I don't want to take professional ethics or all these requirements. Well, you as the student, as the trainee, are free to go to a different school. Different schools have different requirements, use different models. For instance, in Canadian universities, many Canadian universities don't follow the Harvard model, which YSU, for instance, follows. The Harvard model is the one where you have general university requirements along with individual department requirements. Other universities, such as those in Canada, for instance, have only department requirements. So if you're an engineering major or a pre-med major, you may never take a course in sociology or history or philosophy. That is only required if your department says it's required. So you're free to go to a different school. You're free to drop out altogether or to go for an associate's degree or whatever if you don't like the particular way in which a program is put together or the types of requirements that a university may have. Rights of the professional. Given that the student has rights, and since this is a contractual relationship, there are also rights on the side of the professional. So the professional has the right to terminate the relationship if the client demands that he/she act in ways below professional standards. The right to terminate if the pupil refuses to cooperate in the learning process. Analogous models of this are the professional client or the master-apprentice sort of thing. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that in some cases, if a pupil refuses, for instance, to come to class on a regular basis, then that relationship can be terminated. In some schools, the policy is that if a student does not attend a certain percentage of classes, that the instructor is free to fail that student regardless of how they do on exams. So some schools view coming to class, participating in class, or sitting in on lectures as an integral part of the learning process. And if you fail to hold up that part of the agreement, what you agreed to at the beginning when you registered for the course, when you entered the university, then the instructor may simply say, I'm not going to pass that student. The right to terminate the relationship the client demands he/she act ways below professional standards may be cases where students become belligerent, demand things of the professor cannot agree with or go along with, and so might just say that's enough to terminate the relationship as well. This is sort of a rare sort of occurrence, but still is on the part of the professional still allowed. So we can think of these more in terms of the master-apprentice or professional-client relationship, where you have somebody who basically comes to someone and says, I want you to teach me all those things that you know about this area. And they sort of put themselves in the hands of the person who's the teacher or who's the master. The master is supposed to instill that sort of knowledge to the student, but there's nothing to keep either party in the relationship if the other doesn't want to comply with the terms of the agreement. Goals of university education. So even if we conceive of the student-university relationship as contractual or non-paternalistic, one of the things that may be lacking, at least in sort of our own personal view, is what exactly the goal of a university is. We can make the assumption that students entering the university understand what the purpose is, but I think perhaps in a more contemporary setting, we're not quite as clear what a university education is about. More and more it's become about getting a job. I think when I ask most of my students, why are you here? They say something like, because we have to be here. I say, well, why do you have to be here? Well, in order to graduate. Why do you want to graduate? Well, I want to graduate because I want to get a job and I want to have that diploma. Well, why do you want a job? Well, I want a job because I want to make money. Why do you want to make money? Well, because I want to buy things or do certain things. But that's not actually the original intent of a university education. What the sort of traditional view of the university education is the development of capacities for autonomous agency. In other words, free action, to be a reflective individual, to be able to make decisions for yourself while knowing all the options. So we can make decisions, of course, without having a university education, but supposedly having university education means I have more options open to me. I am freer by knowing more of the things that I could do or can do with my life. Of course, there is always that preparation for the professions that's required. So if someone wants to be a teacher or an engineer or a doctor or lawyer, you're going to need that sort of university education to do those sorts of things. The university also has one of its goals, the formation of educated persons fit for citizenship in a free society. Now what this is the sort of intangible benefits of a university education. Unfortunately, with more and more people having to work long hours and go to school part-time or go full-time while working long hours, oftentimes this element of the university isn't experienced by everyone. But in a university setting, what we're supposed to be having is a free flow or free exchange of ideas. So you have lectures, you have organizations that you join, you hear talks from people in different departments, different backgrounds. So the idea here is that the education you're getting is going to prepare you for citizenship in a free society in which ideas are exchanged and debated and sort of worked out in this sort of manner. Again, if we don't have the time to actually spend that time on campus encountering the debates and listening to the lectures and so forth, then some of this may be lost in the contemporary university setting. But that is one of the goals of the university, and why the university will sponsor things like speakers to come in that have written books. They'll have rallies of various sorts, or information sessions, or panel or discussion groups. All of these things are supposed to educate persons in the sort of dialogue necessary for a free society. And finally, of course, is the cultivation of individuals for their own purposes. The university is a place to explore different ideas, to explore different ways of living, different career paths, or different vocations that one might have. So you might have come to university thinking that you wanted to go into business and found out that you in fact really loved art, or drama, or history, or something else. And so individuals can come in, they can experience what 2,000 plus years, 4,000 plus years of civilization have wrought, and decide, here's what I actually want to do with my life. And that's part of what a university education is supposed to do. University student versus the parent-child relationship. As I stated previously, once we understand the goals of the university education and couple that with the idea that this is a contractual relationship that we're entering into, then we can see the sort of sharp distinction between a university-student relationship versus a parent-child relationship. In the student-university relationship, the student voluntarily enters into the relationship with another agent or agency for a specific purpose. In this case, it's all of those things we mentioned, the goals of a university education. Students in university are free to terminate the relationship. So unlike the parent-child relationship, although it can be done, it's extremely difficult, especially for a very small child, to terminate a relationship with their parent. But individuals in a university setting can easily do so. Simply stop paying tuition, don't register for classes. The university on their end can do the same, that if a student falls below a certain grade point or a certain amount of credits, they're free to terminate the relationship with the student as well, or if some other transgression like plagiarism or something else occurs. So all in all, the university-student relationship is essentially a contractual relationship. And so Callahan argues that we ought to view it that way, which also puts a large amount of power on both sides, because this means that students can negotiate the terms of this relationship. And at several schools this has happened. Students have actually changed the nature of course requirements or university requirements. They've demanded courses in certain areas be taught. Sometimes they've actually done just the opposite. There's a situation in which graduate students at the university actually got rid of the comprehensive exams that were involved in their degree. So when we look at this as contractual, we also look at this as something that requires negotiation. So at times, at least, this can go on if we view it, as Callahan says, as a contractual relationship and not as a paternalistic relationship. Academic paternalism and paternalistic rationales. So in a university, we have things like department requirements, college-university requirements, and in-course requirements. The question is, how do I know if these things are paternalistic? The fact that the university is contractual, or that we ought to view it, as Callahan would say, as a contractual relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that some of these things can't be or couldn't be paternalistic. So, according to Callahan, what we need to do is ask ourselves whether all requirements are justified by furthering the academic ideals, that is, what every educated person should know. So departmental requirements or college or university requirements may be paternalistic if they don't pass this sort of test. But all in all, Callahan says, in most cases, universities do in fact put justified sort of requirements out there, that there's a conscious effort to sort of put into or give to every student that knowledge which educated persons should know. Again, this is really a sort of I don't want to say ancient, but a traditional view of a university education. If this were the 1850s or the 1860s, and you were graduating from a university, what most people would look at when you came out was not the particular major, not exactly what you'd studied, but they would assume that since you had finished a university education, that you were an educated person. And to this day, it still occurs. I knew someone personally who had gone to Harvard, graduated from Harvard with a degree in sociology. So if I asked you, what do you think this person's doing now, you'd probably say, well, sociology major, maybe they went to grad school, maybe they're doing social work or something related. This person got their degree from Harvard in sociology, got hired on as a bank vice president. Now, what do the two have to go together? Why would a sociology major suddenly go into banking? Well, a degree from Harvard carries with it a certain sort of cachet. It's the idea that this person is educated. Regardless of what they studied, they've shown that they know certain things. They can assume that this person can write and communicate effectively, that they have a sort of broad background, well-rounded sort of education, and that they can be taught. So they can learn the ins and outs of the banking business, say, without having actually gotten a degree in finance or banking. And so we can use this as sort of a general guideline. When you walk out of the university, it's not just about whether you are going to get a job as an engineer or in business. Because what's also assumed there, one of the goals or part of the goals of the university is to put out educated persons, persons who know more than everyone else, who've shown that by taking these courses, I can assume that once you say, I have a degree from X university, then I can assume that you know how to communicate effectively, that you can write effectively, that you understand sort of the basics of history and philosophy and mathematics and so forth. And so that's Callahan's sort of test. Ask yourself whether these requirements lead to the ideal of what every educated person should know.